We're going to be talking today about the faith of David. I was talking about this a little bit with my mother-in-law. There's a lot that I'm going to be covering, so I might not ask for comments as often as I might should. If I don't ask for comments, stick your hand up. I won't ignore you. But we're going to be getting through a lot today. And speaking of that, let's see. Is my clicker not working? I don't know either. There we go. I got it. All right. It worked.
I always do this.
Want to just look briefly at Hebrews 11 and 32. And what more shall I say, for time will fail me, if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets. So when time fails me today, I just want you guys all to remember that it's scriptural. It's okay that I didn't get through it, because like I said, we're getting through a lot. David was the second king of the United Kingdom. And David's a guy that we probably read a lot about. He's the third king of Israel, if you count Saul's son Ishbosheth there in between Saul and David. But he's the second king of the United Kingdom, the second king of Judah. But Saul's failures really made it necessary for there to be a leader with the faith of David to come after him. Saul, we can remember through his story time and time again, Saul was filled with selfish ambition instead of obedience to God. Saul was more concerned oftentimes with political expedience and swaying to his allies instead of doing God's will. Just a couple of examples here in 1 Samuel 13 and 14. This is when Saul was up at Gilgal and failed to wait for Samuel to make the sacrifices and rituals to reunite the kingdom like he was supposed to. In verse 14 it says, "But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." And then a couple chapters later, in 1 Samuel 15, this is after Saul failed to obey God's will and eradicate the Amalekites and King Agag and all of the livestock, and instead was concerned with political expedience and allowing his soldiers to do what they wanted at times. And now here Samuel talks to him again in verse 10 and 11. "Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. And Samuel was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night." So David was needed. A leader with the faith of David was needed. Somebody that was going to lead the Lord's people toward God no matter what. We're going to look at David today, and I want to focus on three aspects of David's faith. That he had faith to wait for the Lord's time. Also, when the Lord was done waiting, or when it was time to act, David had faith to act promptly and urgently. And whenever success was his, physical success or wealth, David still had the faith to remain with God. These are the three that we're going to look at today. There are some honorable mentions that I almost looked at, but decided that I really didn't have time to talk about the unifying faith of David, and how when the divided kingdom, when he was king of Judah but not yet of Israel, and then he becomes king of Israel after Ishbosheth's death, then he has the unifying faith to punish those assassins. After Abner's death, the general of Saul's army that really was instrumental in getting Ishbosheth appointed king over Israel, after his death, he mourns and again punishes Joab, the assassin. Also, honorable mention is humble faith, and his humility shows through many of his psalms, and also his vulnerability, faith and vulnerability. So honorable mentions, not what we're going to get to today. But let's start with his faith to wait. I want to look in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 12 and 13. And so David is anointed as king 3 times. This is the first of those 3 times. He's anointed in front of his family in a private reception with Samuel. And in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 12 and 13, we read, "So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, 'Arise, anoint him, for this is he.' Then Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel arose and went to Ramah." Now in the next verse, we read that the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, right? So it was necessary for David, even though he was anointed king, as a skilled musician, and also a warrior, he's recommended to Saul to go to him and service the existing king. This king that he's getting ready to take over for, he now has to go and serve by playing the harp for him. David's faith to wait is demonstrated for us in a few different ways, by his actions, of course, but then by his words. How many times do we read in Psalm, and we don't know exactly, I don't expect you to know exactly, but how many times do we read in David's Psalms that he writes how important it is for us to wait on the Lord? In Psalms 25:3, 37:34, 39:7, Psalm 40 and verse 1, Psalm 62 and 5, a couple other times in Psalm 62 that I didn't write down. But then also in the Psalms that I want to read, David is constantly, it seems like, reminding us the importance of waiting on the Lord. Psalm 27:14 says, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord." Psalm 37:7, "Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who carries out wicked schemes." Psalm 69:2 and 3, "I have sunk deep in mire, and there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and a flood overflows me. I am weary with my crying. My throat is parched. My eyes will fail while I wait on the Lord." David even saying that he is willing to wait until his physical body fails him. He is not waiting until he's bored. He is waiting until he can't anymore. The importance of waiting on God. David reminds us with his words, but he also reminds us with his actions. We talked about that first anointing when he's anointed in front of his family. And we don't know the exact time frame, but we know it was a long time from then before David got to become king. Depending on exactly how we want to age it, we know that David was 30 when he was crowned king of Judah. And we know that he was described as a youth when he was serving Saul, so even after he was anointed. David is going to Saul. He is sent to Saul, sent to his brothers who are with the army of Saul, with a gift from Jesse, his father. And if we look at just that fact, that David's 3 oldest brothers are in the army, his next oldest brothers are not in the army, and neither is David himself in the army. If we extrapolate back to Numbers chapter 1, we read in 1 through 3, we also read in 42 through 46 that the fighting age was 20. And so if that, we deduce that David was younger than 20, and probably his immediately older few brothers were younger than 22, then from a teenager to 30, is quite a long time to wait and serve and have faith. Makes me think of what I would do. What if I was promised a great promotion at work or somewhere else? What if I was promised great riches, but I wasn't told that it was going to take this long? I just had to wait years and years, and even a little bit over a decade. How much would my faith struggle because of that? My faith, maybe not in God, but in the promiser. Whoever told me that this was going to happen, I'm going to start doubting that he knows what he's talking about, because here I am living almost an entire life again, what I've already lived, before I get to start to experience the promise being fulfilled. David's faith to wait is demonstrated greatly by his continued reliance on God, even while he is left waiting in these humble circumstances when he is fleeing from Saul. David's faith to wait is also demonstrated because he is willing to wait on the Lord instead of taking it upon himself to fulfill the Lord's promise. He already knows that he is going to be king, that he's been anointed king, and there's a king in his way, King Saul. And while he is fleeing from King Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 4 through 7, we read, this is David's in a cave right now, and Saul comes in. The men of David said to him, "Behold, this is the day of which the Lord has said to you, Behold, I am about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you." Then David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. It came about afterward that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. So he said to his men, "Far be it from me, because of the Lord, that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed." David persuaded his men with these words and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose and left the cave and went on his way. When it seems like, oh, it's right there, that thing that you've been promised, the kingdom that you want, his men tell him, this is the day that the Lord was telling you about. But David had the faith to not step out and take it for himself, not even to let his men. 2 chapters later, in chapter 26, David sneaks into Saul's camp when Saul is actively, as last time, actively seeking David to kill him. Hang on. Forgot to change the slide on my computer. I was like, wait, that's not where we are. In chapter 26, verses 7 and 10, so David and Abishai came to the people by night, and behold, Saul lay sleeping inside of the circle of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the people were lying around him. Then Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hand. Now therefore, please, let me strike him with this spear to the ground with one stroke, and I will not strike him the second time." But David said to Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt?" David also said, "As the Lord lives, surely the Lord will strike him, or his day will come that he dies, or he will go down into battle and perish." So here again, and it's almost even more impressive the second time, I think. Sometimes when you're not expecting something to happen, you're not expecting an opportunity for extreme faith and honesty to come your way, and then all of a sudden it does, and what do? You do your habit, and maybe your habit is honesty and faith, and so you hurry up and do it. And you don't kill your enemy, right? And then you spend the next months thinking, oh man, I let it slip right through my fingers. My opportunity was right there. And then you're almost expecting it again. You replay it in your head maybe. And then it presents itself to you again, the opportunity again. And for David to come in a second time, and this time Abishai even says, hey, I'm going to do it for you. Don't you even worry about it. Just let me do it, and it's going to be a quick death. He ain't going to suffer. I'm not even going to have to strike him twice. I'm an expert at this. And David, again, has the faith to wait on God despite his humble circumstances and his struggles that he is going through, fleeing for his life from King Saul, Saul being his physical enemy. David has the faith to wait on God's timing. We do not have, time will fail me, so I didn't even put them up as slides. But I just want to talk about some of the things that David had to wait through. So in chapter 17, he's sent to his brothers, like I mentioned, to bring them food, and he kills Goliath. Shows great faith by standing up as a youth to a man that is a giant that is defying God and slays him. In chapter 18, especially in verses 10 and 11, David is again in serving Saul when he is tormented by the Spirit. And he's playing the harp for him, and Saul tries to kill him with a spear. So in just one chapter later, Saul's already showing his intent towards David. Later in chapter 18, after Saul fails to kill him, he removes him from his presence and actually makes him a commander of 1,000, a captain in his army. And Saul is thinking that I'll let the Philistines kill him. But David is very successful in battle and wise, as he is following God's command. Later in chapter 18, Saul offers his oldest daughter his wife, again because he wants the Philistines to kill David. And David refuses because he doesn't think that he's worthy to be the king's son-in-law. Later in chapter 18, he offers his other daughter, who loves David, as wife, and he says that he only requires 100 foreskins of the Philistines, or a proof of 100 dead Philistines. And instead, David goes out and kills 200 Philistines and gets Michal. In chapter 19, or especially early in the chapter, Saul tells Jonathan and his other servants that he intends to put David to death. And Jonathan eventually convinces Saul to not do that, to revoke the command. David wins other battles against the Philistines in chapter 19, and he comes back still serving Saul with the harp and song when he is tormented after Saul recounted his command to kill David. Saul again tries to assassinate David in his home but his wife helps him slip out in chapter 19. David and Samuel and Ramah, and Saul sends messengers, and the messengers are overtaken with the Holy Spirit 3 different times prophesying. Saul gets frustrated, so he goes himself and prophesies and lays naked in front of Samuel himself. Chapter 20, David and Jonathan confirm Saul's intent to kill David whenever they're doing the code with the arrows out in the field with Jonathan. In chapter 21, David takes the consecrated bread from Nob, and as well as Goliath's sword, and flees to Gath and pretends to be out of his right mind in order to not be killed by King Achish. In chapter 22, Saul kills those priests at Nob that had helped David. In chapter 23, David delivers the city of Keilah from the Philistines. Saul hears about it, so he goes and he tries to attack David there, and David flees to Ziph. Jonathan comes with him to meet him and minister to David, and David is still fleeing from Saul. In chapter 24, David spares Saul's life. We read about that a bit ago. In chapter 25, Samuel dies. David sends men to Nabal to end, and Nabal ends up dying, and David marries Abigail while they are in the cave. In chapter 26, David again spares Saul's life in his camp, as we read. Chapter 27, David doesn't, Saul in 26, at the end of 26, Saul says, basically, you're safe, David, come back, I won't harm you. David doesn't buy it. And in chapter 27, he flees to Gath, remember, where Goliath was from. He flees to Gath with his 600 men and his family, ends up living in Ziklag that King Achish gives him. And then in chapter 28, David goes up to battle with King Achish against Saul and Israel, but Saul goes to a medium and summons Samuel's spirit. In chapter 29, the Philistine lords are scared of David, and so they convince King Achish to send him back to his land there to Ziklag. In chapter 30, David and his men find out that the Ammonites have raided the city of Ziklag and burned all that they own and taken their families. And so the men are about to kill David because he is angry, but he strengthens himself in the Lord, and he asks God what to do. And he goes and he gets his family back. In chapter 31, Saul and his sons are slain by the Philistines. So David had to wait through a lot, is my only point of paraphrasing all that. It wasn't just David sit there and wait and be bored. It was David go and fight for your life and try to make it to the day that I'm going to make you wait for. As we talked about, David's anointed 3 times. He's anointed privately in the presence of God and his family in Samuel. He's anointed by the elders of Judah in Hebron, and then later he's anointed by the elders of all of Israel, also in Hebron. And in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 3 through 5, it says, "So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron. Then they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all of Israel and Judah." David had the faith to wait, and the entire nation, all of God's people, were blessed because of David's faith to wait. Like I said, it was, King Saul's failures made a leader with David's faith necessary. And David had the faith, but he wasn't ready yet, so he had to wait, and everybody was blessed by that. Let's talk next about David and his faith to act. So I had to be at 9:25. I'm 2 minutes early. Are there any comments at this stage? Yeah. Yeah. Should have never happened. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, I don't know who I got to mention it to, but man, wouldn't a class on Saul be great? But yeah, like he was mentioning, David was only there because of Saul's failures. Samuel tells Saul that he would have established Saul's kingdom forever if he had done it. And so David wouldn't have needed to be there, like you say. It didn't need to happen, but it needed to happen because of what did happen. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. So next, we're going to talk about David and his faith to act. So he had his faith to wait, his faith to pause. But I want you to put yourself in that situation. And I can think of a lot less impressive situations that I've been in. When you are good at waiting, then it might seem like waiting is always the answer. when waiting is what is required, then maybe waiting is the answer. And I think about the analogy, if all you have is a hammer and nail, or if all you have is a hammer in your tool pouch, then every problem looks like a nail, right? And so because of how long David demonstrated his ability to have a strong faith to wait for God, I believe that his faith to act is more impressive than maybe somebody else's faith to act when all that we see is them acting or them doing. But David was able to act when God was done waiting. I want to look in 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 7 through 10. So this is the son of the priest at Nob that David got the bread and the sword of Goliath from, that was later killed by Saul. The son escaped and came to David and stayed with David. Then David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said to him, pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. So David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook of Bezor, where those left behind remained. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 were too exhausted to cross the brook Bezor, and remained behind. So as I talked about in my fast paraphrasing, this is in 1 Samuel chapter 30. This is when David and his 600 men are living in Ziklag, the land of the Philistines. And they go to war, they march to battle, but then they don't partake in the battle. Instead, they turn around and get sent back to Ziklag. When they get to their cities, the Ammonites have raided their city, burned it, taken all of the valuables, and more importantly, taken all of their families. There was nobody left there. And the men are threatening David, angry, as you can imagine. And David is asked God here, what should I do? Temptation to wait, but God wasn't ready for him to wait this time. He was ready for him to act. And David had the faith to act. It was his family. And so I'm sure there was a lot of adrenaline and other things involved, but he was no doubt tired from just having marched back from where he came from. Of course he was tired, because 200, 1/3 of his 600 men were too tired to even cross a creek. Maybe their creeks was bigger than creeks we're used to, but they wouldn't even cross a creek to go and help their family. Maybe they were the 200 men that didn't have families yet. They were too young, and that's why they let their exhaustion overtake them. But their best friends' families just got taken, and they were too exhausted to go. But David had the faith to act instead of waiting only. And they overtake them, and just like we thought they would. I want to look in 2 Samuel chapter 5 as well. Now this is after David has been crowned king, both of Judah and of Israel. And the Philistines hear about it and want to go make an example of this new king. Now the Philistines came up once again and spread themselves out in the valley of Rephaim. When David inquired of the Lord, he said, you shall not go directly up. Circle around behind them and come at them in front of the balsam trees. It shall be when you hear the sound of marching on the tops of the balsam trees, then you shall act promptly. For then the Lord will have gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines. Then David did so, just as the Lord had commanded him, and struck down the Philistines from Geba as far as Gezer. And so again, here, David, now that he is king, he has finally reached the promise. And he is not only king of Judah, but he is now king of all of God's people, as he has been waiting for. But he didn't need to wait this time. He needed the faith to act. And I love the description, you shall act promptly when you hear the sound of the marching. And David did so. All right, last I want to talk about his David and his faith to remain. Any other comments about David and his faith to act? Yeah, Clint.
I think one of the things that seems significant is that he has a faith to act, but in contrast to so many other people we see in Scripture, he inquires of the Lord before he acts. I mean,
Yeah.
he's ready to go if needed, but he makes sure that's what God wants. I mean, like a huge contrast, of course, to Saul.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because as I mentioned in my honorable mentions, I was trying to have 6 faiths of David, but I didn't have time. And so that's one that was let off that I should have included here. That he had the faith to act, but he wasn't just running around doing his own actions. He had the faith to inquire of God, as we read time and time again. He inquires of the Lord to find out what he should do, what actions he should do. Thank you for pointing that out. Anything else? Yeah.
God is the one, it's his army. Israel is God's army. Mm-hmm. And every time the judges went out and Saul went out when he did the right thing, and David, they're acknowledging that the army of God is the one that's leading and fighting for them. They just need to, like you're saying, express the faith, get ready, and follow. God gets the glory. And David understood that all the time. That's why he wouldn't strike Saul.
Yep. Yep, that's great. And reading through David's Psalms, David also points that out obviously. Like for instance, the one that comes to mind is Psalm 18, when he's talking about the Lord is my strength, the Lord is my stronghold. That he gives him the credit for being the reason for the success and not his own actions and expertise. Anything else? Okay, let's go ahead and move on. We're going to talk now about the faith of David to remain. Faith to remain. So my wife told me that my title for this didn't make sense because originally my title was Faith to Not Seek Else. And she was like, you're missing parts of speech in that sentence. It doesn't work. So we're going to talk about David's faith to remain with God after his success, after his physical success. And because he was so good at giving God the credit for that success is no doubt the reason that he was able to remain. But think about other kings that we have example of in the Bible. Think about other wealthy people that we have examples of in our own lives, that once they make it physically, man, it is so hard for them to continue to have faith in God, faith to remain with God, faith to not seek something else. Maybe that's what it should have been, faith to not seek something else. David had the faith to remain. Go ahead and look at 1 Chronicles chapter 21. So 1 Chronicles chapter 21, to get our minds wrapped around the timeline, this is after David is king of both Judah and Israel. After David is done waiting for that promise, let's read First Chronicles 21, verses 1 through 4. Then Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. So David said to Joab and to the princes of the people, "Go number Israel from Beersheba even to Dan, and bring me word that I may know their number." Joab said, "May the Lord add to his people 100 times as many as they are, but my lord, the king, are they not all my lord's servants? Why does my lord seek this thing? Why should he be a cause of guilt to Israel?" Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab. Therefore Joab departed and went throughout all Israel and came to Jerusalem. Excuse me. Why was it wrong? This last part, this is where I'm wanting interaction. Why was it wrong for David to number his people, to take a census of his army?
It wasn't in the number of men that he had in his army, but it was in what the Lord had as strength. Oh, sorry.
So because he didn't inquire of the Lord first?
That's right.
Yeah. Anything else? I agree with that. Yeah.
God was supposed to ordain counting. He would tell them when to count.
Yeah. Yeah, God would tell them when to count, and he didn't even ask God. Yeah. Yep. Why do we think David was, we know it was because Satan, we're told that. Satan tempted him. But why do we think David was tempted to count his people? What information did he want to know by counting his people? How strong his army was, right? How strong was his army? God strong. Exactly as strong as God wanted it to be. He didn't need to number his people because he knew where his power was coming from, right? So he's provoked by Satan to number his people. After he tells Joab, the leader of his army, that he wants to take census of his people and of his army, Joab tries to convince him not to. Joab recognizes the failure that this would be. David wasn't the only one that knew that he got his strength from God. David wasn't the only one that knew that he needed to wait for God's ordinance before he acted. Also, Joab knew that. And Joab said, "Why would you bring guilt on your people by doing this thing?" But David was king, so he played the king card on Joab and did it anyway. And Joab comes back. Let's look now in verses 7 and 8, still in 1 Chronicles. God was displeased with this thing, so he struck Israel. David said to God, "I have sinned greatly in that I have done this thing, but now please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly." So God is displeased with David's numbering of his army, with his relying on his physical numbers for his strength, trying to take inventory of how strong he is or whom he can go defeat. God's displeased by this. But David, even though he was king, again, he's king over all of Israel now. David, even though he was king, he had the faith to remain with God. And what I mean by that is, how many times do we have things that are under our own purview, my money, my car, my whatever, and if we do it, we do not want to be challenged on what we do with our own things. The kingdom of Israel was David's physically. I understand God is the king, the power, But David is the king of Israel right now. And because he was the king, as the leader of the army arguing with him demonstrated, his word prevailed. He won the argument. But even though it was his, he had the faith, the humility when it was brought up to him by God. David said, "I have acted very foolishly," even though it was his own thing. And then look at 9 through 12. The Lord spoke to Gad, David's seer, saying, "Go and speak to David, saying, 'Thus says the Lord, I offer you 3 things. Choose for yourself one of them, which I will do to you.' So Gad came to David and said to him, 'Thus says the Lord, take for yourself either 3 years of famine, or 3 months to be swept away before your foes, while the sword of your enemies overtakes you, or else 3 days of the sword of the Lord, even pestilence in the land, and the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the territory of Israel. Now therefore consider what answer I shall return to him who sent me.'" So God is displeased. David recognizes that he has acted foolishly and that he maybe deserves some punishment. Gad receives word from the Lord and delivers it to David and says, "Choose one of these 3 punishments. You're going to have famine for 3 years, you're going to lose wars against your enemies for 3 months, or you're going to have to deal with me for 3 days." Which one would you guys pick?
Israel will be able to handle and still survive.
3 days with God, because God knows how much that Israel will be able to handle.
It's more merciful. If I was in that predicament,
Yeah, that's what David agrees with you, because of God's mercy, is what Ed was mentioning. Yeah, because of your mercy. Let's look in verse 13. David said to Gad, "I am in great distress. Please let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are very great, but do not let me fall into the hand of man." And this is going to touch on a few different faiths. But as we talked about, David was fully aware of where his strength came from, that his strength came from God. Despite his physical dominance time and time again in battle, and the expertise we might have ascribed to David because of that, David knew that it was because of God. If you win time and time again, maybe it's easy for you to believe that I'm just a winner. That's just who I am. My strategy is too good. It might have been tempting for David to say, "I know I can take care of my enemies, the Philistines. I know I can wipe out the Amalekites and the and the others." Yeah. And so it might have been tempting for David to say, "Let me go deal with them. I know I can overtake them." But David had the humility and the faith to know that his victories came from God. His victories did not come from himself or his own expertise or his own doing. His victories came from his strength and his stronghold, which was God himself. And so David goes and answers and says, "Let me fall into the hand of God, for his mercies are great." And, less than 60 seconds, he was right. God comes in and he attacks with the pestilence, just like he says. He's getting ready. He sends his angel down. His angel has his sword drawn over Jerusalem, it says. And David's eyes are open so that he can see the angel of the Lord above him with his sword drawn. And David prays and he says, "This was my doing. Don't punish your people. Punish me. Punish my father's house. Take it out on me." And God's mercies went out. And he doesn't, and he calls off the angel that had his sword drawn over Jerusalem, tells David to go build an altar. David does, and then David's not even able to go to the altar and use it because he's so scared still of the might of the Lord, the mercies of God that came to him. All right. So today we talked about the three faiths of David. These are not encompassing faiths of David, just the three that we looked at today was David and his faith to wait, a faith that we should be willing to emulate ourselves, that we should be able to wait on the God's timing. His faith to act as soon as God was done waiting, as soon as it was time for action, David was willing to do it promptly and urgently. And his faith to remain, no matter what comes, success or failure. David was willing to stay with God. We should be too. Any final comments after the bell? All right. Thank you, guys.